this evening's event. But if you have any reason to worry, everyone comes in muted, and only the people who appear in the little yellow box who are unmuted will be recorded and making their way to YouTube. We also like to take a minute to thank everyone for shopping locally and shopping at independent bookstores. It really means a lot during this time. All right, and let me hand things over to Rachel.
Hi there. If you have any questions for our authors at any point during the evening, please use the chat box. Davith and I will store up your questions as we go, and we will ask them for you at the end of the event. That's all the housekeeping. Tonight, it is my very great pleasure to welcome Emily Layden to Northshire Live. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Billfold, and Runner's World, and she's a longtime friend of the Northshire. I'm pretty sure I met her very briefly all the way back in 2013 when the Saratoga store first opened. So it's a true honor and a delight to get to celebrate with her the release of her debut novel, All Girls, which came out just today and got a great review just today in the New York Times. So it's a very exciting moment. Yay. Tonight, Emily will be interviewed by fellow debut novelist Ellie Eaton, author of The Divines, which was named a most anticipated book of 2021 by Entertainment Weekly and has been flying off the shelves. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Live. And Emily, why don't you start us off with a short reading from All Girls?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for having us and for supporting this novel. I'm going to read right from the top of the book. The opening section functions as kind of a prologue and situates us in like the where and why of the novel. There are no major highways into the northwest corner of Connecticut that comprises Litchfield County. Travelers from the more densely populated suburbs of New York, from Westchester and Long Island, from Danbury and Greenwich, find themselves frustrated by the path of winnowing thoroughfares, turnpikes and interstates splitting again and again like capillaries from an artery. No matter the starting point, the final approach to Atwater requires navigating Litchfield's web of two-lane county roads, flanked in most cases by farmland and medium-thick deciduous forest, the only signage suggesting lowered speeds around particularly treacherous curves. In this corner of New England, like the PCH in certain parts of Southern California, like the pavement that cuts between oil fields outside Odessa, these are the roads meant for windows down and music on loud. This is where teenagers wrap themselves around telephone poles. The vandal, if vandalism is what you wanted to call it, clearly knew this when she considered her options. Unlike the question of whether the act was vandalism, there was near unanimous agreement that the culprit was, in fact, a she. She clearly knew that families dropping their daughters off at school had their pick of county routes to zig and zag across like ants to the nest. She might have also known that the nearest billboards were at the interchanges and highway overpasses near Waterbury and Hartford. She might have further estimated the number of students who drove that way and decided not enough. When she placed her order with Vistaprint, the label was printed neatly on the back of each poster board for 118 by 27-inch signs and 100 stands. It was with the understanding that the best approach was a scattershot one, shrapnel blasted across the entire county. She likely researched Connecticut laws and local ordinances regarding yard signs and public property and determined that what she was planning was probably not illegal, not exactly, but that it was best to plant the signs under the cover of darkness on a night as close to opening day as possible. And so when the residents of Kent and Goshen and Roxbury woke one morning in late August, the day the boarding school at the heart of their suburban rural community was set to open for the academic year, and made their way to the little main streets and intersections that held their corner stores and gas stations, they found their roads peppered with little black rectangles, low and squat and set 30 feet from the pavement. It wasn't until they passed 2 or 3 that the words coalesced into meaning, the R's and P's sorted and organized by a fogged morning brain. Longer still, it took to identify the purpose of these campaign signs in a non-election year. And so the phrasing of the placards planted like seeds in a 15-mile radius from the Atwater School settled confusedly onto the surrounding community. A rapist works here, they read, the message positioned next to a sepia-toned photo of a schoolhouse steeple, haloed in black like an antique portrait. They were gone almost as soon as they'd popped up, lingering only for a day or two, so that those that remained withered like mailbox balloons after a birthday party, wilted and random, more frequent the farther you traveled from campus. They guessed the school came around and tore them up, or maybe it was their neighbors for whom the vulgarity of the signs was too much. Who wanted to look at that word every day? Who wanted to think about that kind of violence? Because of this, few of them had the chance to look up the URL that slugged to the bottom of each sign, the one that might have directed them to a petition to extend Connecticut's statute of limitations on rape and sexual assault, a kind of activism that might have struck them as surprisingly reasonable, given the shock of the headline and the tabloidishness of the signs. In time, the townspeople for whom Atwater was a kind of ivory tower would decide the words on the yard signs weren't meant for them, not really. And the act of vigilante justice would fade in their memories to a kind of sad and misguided prank. They were used to this kind of thing, the whispers of scandal that accompany the very, very privileged. It was never any of their business.
Bravo.
Thank you.
As you know, I love your book. My copy looks like something from my school days, which was sort of dog-eared and scribbled all over. And, you know, I think it's been a very strange time for writing, well, for the whole world. But, you know, I don't think anyone's publishing experience has quite been how we might have daydreamed it would be. But it's been such a highlight of my year, getting to read this book and getting to know you. So,
oh my God.
So excited
Ditto.
to have questions at you.
Ditto. The feeling is very mutual.
So massive congratulations, particularly on that New York Times piece. Very exciting. Obviously, the section of the book you read at the very beginning sets the scene for your novel. But you know, there's been this accusation about the school, which becomes public and then gets covered up multiple times throughout the book. And the way that you plot the year of events comes from this almost like a Greek chorus of voices throughout the book, which I loved. For me, it was like layering all these layers of colour so that you look through it and you finally get the sort of full experience of the school and what it means and what this event means when you come to the end. And then I obviously went back to the beginning and began taking the sections apart again because I'm a book nerd, and that bit was lovely. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about why it was that you chose to tell your story through like multiple voices rather than perhaps taking one perspective, letting that one voice guide us the whole way through.
Yeah, you know, I think that I actually never imagined this book as a single protagonist novel. From the outset, there were just too many stories that I wanted to tell, and it felt like unreasonable to burden a single character with all that I wanted to say. And I think separately, another thing I'm trying to do here is really provide a portrait of a community, not just a single person. And so that's how I arrived at that. I love calling it a Greek chorus, but yeah, that sort of polyphonic structure.
Yeah, was there one voice that, you know, for me with the opening of my book, that was the very first line I had in my head for years actually before I wrote it. So, and I just was so curious about which character, each character feels incredibly fully formed and real. And I wondered who you saw first, like which was the girl that hooked you in?
Well, I don't know if she hooked me in, but I did start at the beginning. So Lauren was the first person I ever wrote, the first person I ever conceived. I think because I wanted to, just like we see in that prologue, I wanted to capture not just that the literal arrival at this like cloistered, removed space, but also I wanted the reader to have the outsider's experience. And Lauren is a little bit of an outsider too. So we get oriented and welcomed as she is, right?
Yeah, that makes sense because she's the new girl, isn't she?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, but what I was thinking about afterwards, which, and particularly this morning when I was thinking about, you know, your review by Kate Elizabeth Russell, was thinking about a book like My Dark Vanessa, which really seems to be in conversation with your book in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. The two people that really don't appear in your narrative at all, except, you know, yet they are at the heart of this book, are, you know, the accuser and the rapist himself. So they don't, and I presume that was a very intentional thing on your part. So I wondered why you decided never to give either of those two characters a voice in the book.
Well, it actually reminds me a little bit of your book, right? In that the narrative is really about ripple effects, right? So we have the rape in 1995 and the ensuing lawsuit, but those are just like, that's like just the rock out in the ocean. And the book is really about all of those waves rippling out from it, right? How the girls in the community are processing this information while still trying to go about the regular business of being a teenager and growing up and finding their own voices and identities, right?
Yeah. Ooh, excuse me, it's the crazy wind banging into the wall. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense to me. I mean, what's fascinating about the book is, you know, in addition to the structure of it being through different voices, is that each of the sections is labelled with the name of an event at the school, and it sort of follows, you know, through a full school year. So you get to see them arrive, and they have these very ritualistic induction experiences, and there's the equivalent of a prom, and the various moments of ringing ceremony, and there's very much a sense of enjoying the ritual of the book and the pageantry of this sort of very private elite world. And I just wondered what role you thought that these rituals played in the book for you. I mean, I know I have similar ones in my book, so I was instantly fascinated by how there are a few that are similar, there are a few that are different, but like what you felt that they bring to the story.
Yeah, and I love that. I loved that about reading your book, about just seeing all of those things that were repeated across our two fictional schools, which just speaks to like that the places we've created are hyper specific but also universal, right? But anyway, to answer your question, I think that, and I wonder if you felt this way too, but because our protagonists do have different lenses on their schools. Yeah. I think that what I was trying to do with that, not just the pacing of the school year, but the pageantry, as you say, tradition bonds us to a place or to a community, right? And traditions are so important at these schools. And I wanted to show, right, how, you know, there's a character who says at one point, this place sinks into your veins, right? Like that is, I wanted to show how that happens, that indoctrination kind of, right?
There's a shared language, I think, that's so interesting. You know, in the early scenes, you see Lauren sort of fumbling with the words almost. She doesn't know what any of these were. You have very specific language for which girl plays, you know, proctors, and suddenly you see her, you get little snapshots of her later in the book, a completely different person, very confident, fluent in the language of Atwater. And it made me laugh because I think that I read those pages and I was like, oh, that's universal to any old institution. I think then it made, you know, I could see the crossover in our two works and found it.
Right, like it becomes yours, and it becomes yours very quickly, right? Like you feel a lot of ownership over it very fast.
I think there's also a sense of, you know, with that kind of ritual, it's about being in a club. So there's that feeling of, in your book, I think it's what brings the girls together and gives them a sense of sisterhood. And in mine, it's almost the opposite effect. It's intended to keep everyone else out. It's less about the way that people are inside the building, but a rejection of everything that exists in the outside world. It's interesting to see how those two, the same pageantry is used with quite opposite effect.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep.
I mean, the striking difference between our two books is that although the rape that happens in your book is set, you know, in the 80s, your book is you know, 2015, I think, or thereabouts, isn't it? So it's a kind of a modern, relatively modern world. in comparison to the Divines, which is the school sections are written really before any technology has arrived on the scene. And I really found your description of technology in the book oddly comforting. Like, I feel like every other human being in the world right now, we're all a bit terrified of our gadgets because we hate them, but we can't stop looking at them, and we feel like they control us. And I think, you know, they get a pretty negative rap in the press for, you know, particularly for young girls, I think, about body shaming and, you know, access to porn, which might really warp young women's views of what they're expected to be like and what sex means. And you know, I think, and then suddenly here's this book that doesn't dismiss any of these things, but it also says, look at these young women using these tools and not being controlled by them, and saying, like, we'll take Snap or whatever, and we'll use it against this institution that's not listening to us, and this is going to be our voice. And I just found that. And I think there was, it's particularly the character of Emma in the book, who is in an open same-sex relationship, but she's really exploring her sexuality. And she uses Tumblr, and she describes it, I think, at one point as her safe space. And that's just like, that's amazing, because one thing I don't think of with the internet as being as particularly safe, and suddenly it was like, well, maybe it is. Maybe I'm just the wrong generation. I'm really aging myself, but I just wonder if you could speak to, like, you know, how you feel about technology, both in your book and in real life, because you have a very light touch, I think, on the internet, on the World Wide Web. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about social media in your book, or technology, and how you felt about it.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, right? Like, I can't believe that I wrote a book that portrays social media in any sort of positive light, because I am terrified of it and need to have hard boundaries around my use of it. And it feels like I betrayed myself in doing this. But I think that what you're sort of talking around there, and how the girls use social media is it's like, you know, paraphrase like Jack Dorsey here, right? Like, it's a democratizing tool, which I just mean, and I think what I'm trying to communicate in the book is that it is the only option the girls have available to them. And you see in other moments, right, Louisa with the newspaper, for example, right, that they are trying to be heard in other ways, and repeatedly just dismissed and shut down. But they're smart and savvy, and they have this other resource available to them that clearly the administration doesn't understand, or isn't quick enough on, or whatever. And so they're using that as a way to be heard, as a way to assert their voices. I think that, and I hope this comes across, that it would not be their preference to have to communicate that way, right? Like, they wish that they could go to that meeting with the head of school and she would really hear them, and that they could feel like they had an actual seat at the table, not that they had to backdoor a seat at the table.
It is that brutal moment where they've done all of this work on their school articles, and it's really detailed. It's not a sort of amateurish school paper. It really feels like they've thought very deeply and tried to consider all sides of the argument. And then it is heartbreaking when they're shut down. You just feel like, here are some very smart, very strong young women who aren't being listened to. And I suppose it made me think about, you know, the larger context of the book, and voices that have gone unheard, even when they, you know, and how the internet might work in a positive light for people to finally have a voice, or a way to talk about things that have happened. I mean, you know, obviously one of the side effects of the internet is that it can have a rather sort of damaging effect on your mental health. I mean, I think you and I both have talked about that and felt that, and you know, I am looking forward to a slightly quieter period in my life when I can put up my freedom app again and go back to work. And mental health is something that I think you handle so beautifully in this book. There is something about the teenage experience and a simmering sense of anxiety in some of the characters. I mean, I'm thinking about Macy in particular, who suffers from intense anxiety and has ways of handling it. So she has this very positive outlet of running, and I know that you're a runner, and then slightly more destructive issues around eating and you know, not eating rather. And I just wondered, I know from the acknowledgements that you know, access to therapy is something that's important to you and you're quite outspoken about, and I just wondered if you could talk a little about how important it was to capture those sort of mental health issues in your book.
Yeah, I think my therapist is on here, so just shout out, you're the best, Kelly. But I think, you know, with Macy, I am demonstrating, so Macy struggles with anxiety, with OCD. Her issues with eating are actually more closely like something called ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So it's, I have heard already some readers saying that she's anorexic, or and it can be very hard to tell the difference between the two. But with Macy, her relationship to food is really structured around her obsessiveness and her anxiety. And I wanted to show that sort of, like, to use a therapy term, right, the comorbidity of those things, how it's like a storm in her brain and body all the time. But I also wanted to show that we've got this like pervasive anxiety happening kind of almost in all of the girls, right?
Absolutely.
And there is like so there's a difference between what we watch Macy experience and also this sort of underlying anxiety that's just like maybe not essential, but like it's a trademark experience of girlhood, perhaps especially now, I think.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show that through also how the girls are watching one another constantly, right? A lot of their anxiety is oriented around sizing themselves up in relationship to the people around them. There's a lot of like I'm like Corey, like there's a lot of their they talk about how they move and how they position their bodies and how they carry themselves, and it's all about just like observing and mirroring a little bit, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's why the structure of your book is so wonderful, is because you really have that sense of every time it shifts to a new character, it's as if you just, the gaze shifts as well, and you really do have a sense of them watching each other. And also you're right about the anxiety, that sort of, that like vibration, it's almost like a jitter that runs through the book, that's even in the most poised and confident of girls, there's in every case there's an element of women trying to work out who they are, I think, feeling a little bit out of control, partly because the institution they're in isn't taking control, and they know that they're not hearing the full story, that they're not being honest with them, and so they don't know if they're being protected in the way that these girls need to be protected. And so, you know, it's interesting because I think obviously we've both written books about the teenage experience, and in the way that you capture those vibrations, the jitters of what it means, the uncomfortableness of being in a teenage body, so well. And it felt like you were very fearless in your handling of the teenage experience. I mean, there were certain points where I was just sort of clapping almost, because I was like, she's actually going to describe a girl squeezing her blackheads out, or her, like examining her skin in the mirror, and like vomiting. Like, you just felt like you really leaned into those experiences in a way that I think is quite rare. I think there's this sort of sense of a very glossy view of teenagers that you see on the television that just does not feel true to life, and so absolutely applaud you for that. And I wondered why you felt that for writers that there was such fertile ground in writing about the teenage experience. Like, what is it that fascinates us about this field?
Yeah, do you want to answer this question? Because you do the same thing.
No.
I think that at the end of the day, I wanted to write a book about girlhood, right? Like, that is, I wanted to try to do justice to the best of my ability to that experience, and really like to the depth and capacity of teenage girls. And that means showing not just all of the things that I think they're amazing at, or all of the reasons they're amazing, and powerful and thoughtful and empathetic and courageous, but also showing all of the things they struggle with. Because I think that what we do to teenage girls, the media, is flatten them and commodify them. And I wanted to show their humanness, and that means like popping your zits in the mirror.
It was so good. I was like reliving every time I've got up and close to a mirror, and just it was just brilliant. And there's an expression you use actually about one of the characters who I'll ask you a question about in a moment, but which I think so perfectly describes the teenage experience. But it was living on a knife edge, or like being on a knife edge, because you really get a sense with these girls that they are very confident and strong. They're certainly much more mature than the girls I describe in my book, and they've evolved. They have a even if they're just trying on the language, I think, for size, they are learning to use it and find their voices. Yet they're also in quite dangerous positions and quite vulnerable at the same time. It's a real mix of both. And I think the character, for me, that just really summed up that experience was Chloe. Poor Chloe in the cornmaze, because I felt incredibly moved by that section, because I think it was dealing with a rite of passage that almost all young women go through, which is the early sexual experiences and losing their virginity. And it felt so painfully true of, I think, of the pressure for young girls to have experience and to sort of get that out of the way, and yet not wanting to, and not knowing how to say no. And in that scene, in a book about rape, I started to question what was happening. I think some people could read it and say, oh, she's being raped in that moment. But it doesn't tally up to Lauren's view of rape at the beginning of the book, with the idea of being pinned down and your mouth covered. And I just sort of wondered, how hard you found it to write that scene, and in a way what you're trying to say in that moment about early sexual experiences and the subject of consent.
Yeah. So we have like 4 hours to talk about this, right? I think.
Okay. I've got no idea what the time is. We'll just keep talking until the first.
I actually think that the scene in the corn maze itself, like that scene, I don't know if I would say that was hard to write. I think that what was really important to me to get right with all the stuff before that scene.
Absolutely.
Because, right, as you're saying, it's Chloe is having this whole complicated thought process about what she wants, whether she thinks she wants it authentically, or does she only want it because she feels as though she's supposed to want it? Does she feel behind? Again, it's that sizing herself up in comparison to the other girls around her. Is she doing it just so that she doesn't chicken out, right? She doesn't want to make the boy uncomfortable once they're together.
Mm-hmm.
So that, creating that psychological tightrope for her, which I think is very familiar to a lot of girls, it was important to me to get that process right, or to do it as much justice as I could, I think.
You think you handled it so well, particularly because it's not a clear cut thing in her mind. Like, I think she says she both wants to be seen and both doesn't want to be seen by someone else coming through the maze. And I think that sums up so much of how we feel about those moments as women. You know, you want this thing, but you're scared of it. You know, it's a very strange time. And then in general, I think at that age, not knowing what's okay and what's not okay. And I think that very common feeling that a lot of people have had in the last few years of looking back at moments in their life and wondering if that thing that happened actually in retrospect was really pretty off or was not okay. And I think you describe it so well. One of the alumni is recounting Karen's relationship with the teacher that she accuses of rape. And I think what they describe it said, she said, oh, it seemed something a little weird happened. And I was like, yes, that's exactly the phrase. It's like she can't articulate what happened. It's only as an adult that she can come back and look at it and say, yeah, it was more than a little weird, you know. And so I thought you really handled that so well, that idea of looking back and understanding now that these things were not right.
Thank you. Well, and I also think, right, that it's also, so I think it's not just it's hindsight, like you're talking about, absolutely. But there's also this thing unique to the teenage girl experience, particularly now in this conversation we're having about consent and power and agency, right? To be told as a 17-year-old, because you're 17, you don't have any power, you don't have any agency, you can't consent, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What do you do with that? I just think that is so much to process, right?
Absolutely. And I think it ties in, you know, to this conversation about the institution itself. There are moments throughout the book where you've placed correspondence with the head of school. She's reacting to the latest news that's coming through, or something that the girls have done, and you get to see it, you know, with these email messages. And it really made me think about, you know, the role that the school plays in the book, and how institutions, not just like Atwater, but as we've seen in all areas of our lives, value their reputation above the individual story of each woman. The rapist in the book is a semi-famous artist, and the girls make a judgment, probably correctly, that the school, it was more important to them that they have this sort of, you know, very impressive figure in their school who continued to teach there for years afterwards, and then you know, Karen is removed. So I know that you set this book prior to the Me Too movement. But I wondered in the writing and editing of your book, how much you were writing in conversation with what was going on in the news.
Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, I initially placed the book in 2015 because I didn't want to have to deal with Donald Trump.
Fair enough.
It felt like this thing. It's sort of like how writing right now. It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't want to set it in 2020 or 2021 because then I got to write a pandemic into it, right? Yeah. So that was where it started. But no, I think that what it became was, I guess, a desire to show an evolving language, right? So I think that if the girls had had the Me Too movement, some of what they would have said or how they might have acted might have been, they would have been equipped with a certain with a certain dictionary that would have changed the game at least a little bit, right? And I think that it's interesting to look at how quickly the discourse has changed, but also, of course, like not really at all. Like it's you know, so yeah, it feels like all I thought about capturing was how the conversation is evolving and ongoing.
Yeah, and I think you do that very well. I think even within certain characters, there's an evolution in how they feel about what's happened, and a sense of betrayal by the school, which is so fascinating. And it's very difficult for me. I don't think of your book as a thriller, but there's obviously this sense of like, who is it that's responsible for these pranks? And so I can't really speak to that, but one of the characters involved, you're so surprised because you feel like, oh, there's someone that wouldn't betray the school, that would be so loyal for various reasons. And I think that was so cleverly handled, like how much bravery you have to stand up to places like that. Even now, I think, even when we know what we know about how these places operate, I don't think it's as simple as, writing a tweet. I think it's a much more complex decision-making process and a sense of gradual awareness that you work really well through the book. So, excuse me. I mean, one of the things about the institution that fascinated me was the sense of privilege that goes hand in hand with places like this. My greatest anxiety in writing my book was a little bit to do with describing a very white world. Because particularly in Britain in the 90s, that's just what these places looked like. And so it was really fascinating to me to see a school set in 2015, which has definitely progressed from the world that I describe in my book. There are open same-sex relationships in the school. It's not completely white, but you also don't make it seem like a utopia. I think you are quite frank in some instances with, particularly around the Asian characters and discussions about like their hair or how they're treated. The character of Olivia, who I think you describe as like the poster child for the school, of someone who can, a strong, beautiful, smart Black female character who's who's thriving in that environment. Was it important to you to write about issues of class and race in your book? Like, how much did they influence your writing, do you think?
So I think that the best we can do as white writers writing about predominantly white spaces is to not present that privilege without comment. Absolutely. Right? And so I think that I tried to do what I think is our responsibility, which is to just, at a minimum, be aware of how race and class are playing out in these spaces. And yeah, I mean, they are, they are, these schools are becoming increasingly diverse, but they're still predominantly white spaces with a lot of white authority figures. And it would have been dishonest or rose-colored or something to pretend otherwise, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do a good job of showing those moments where the two worlds sort of collide and you realize that they're in this very, very privileged space. And what I found interesting about that was that when I was writing about those worlds, I guess it could be seen as a takedown of the system. Like I went into it blazing, I think, feeling like, I mean, my school quite literally burns. It gets destroyed by the end. Yeah. There's a riot. And that's not the feeling that I was left with in this book. There are wonderful moments of sisterhood. There's a scene early on in the sort of what I suppose you'd call hazing, which isn't really a word they use in Britain, and it doesn't feel like hazing, but there's an anxiety by one of the characters that there is going to be this awful induction process, and she dreads it, and what it ends up being is sort of wonderful. They're like stripped naked and they run through the grass and they're in the water, and they just have this sense of togetherness. They're very smart women, I think, who are learning to use their voice. And I think there's a sense of optimism about your book. They don't, despite the school's failures, there is a pride in being an Atwater girl that is very different to a Divine, I think, or at least in a minor Asa who is much more of an outcast. And in those final moments, they wonder whether they'll miss their school. And I sort of wondered, if you could maybe answer that question. Do you think these girls will miss Atwater?
Like, absolutely. And whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I think that the school has imprinted on them, and they have imprinted on the school. It is a part of who they are. Yeah. And there's no undoing that. It's just like a fabric of their existence. But I think I love hearing you talk about that initiation scene, because I think the real optimism of the book, for me at least, is that the girls love each other very much. And that was a real goal of mine in writing this, was just to show the tremendous care and empathy that I know teenage girls are capable of.
Yeah, that absolutely came through. Like, I was trying to think of any moments in the book where they really attack each other. And there are a few uncomfortable, when the tumbler is like, though there are a few moments where you're like, oh, I remember what it feels like when you do butt heads with one of your friends. But for the most part, they admire each other and they really do look after each other. And I think that is, despite the negative elements that surround institutions like that, I think one of the beautiful things about it is that they do look after each other. It is a family to a lot of places.
And I think you see that in your book too, like Jo and Lauren, is that her name? Yeah. I mean, there is like there's some that they can be mean to each other, but there's real tenderness there too. And it's that tenderness that feels really important to also lift up and highlight. Yeah,
it's both sides of the teenage experience. I mean, you write about teenage girls in such an authentic way that it was really not much of a surprise when you look at your biography and see that you spent quite a lot of time working in girls' schools. And I wonder, you know, really, I'm always fascinated by the seed of a novel, like at what moment you felt like, oh, this is an area that I want to jump into, like this is an important story to tell. Was it while you were working in schools, or was it after?
Well, I was working in schools as I was writing this. I had, you know, I wrote from 5 to 6 in the morning and then went to teach during the day. I think it's such a cliche, a lame cliche thing to say, but like we write what we know, we tell the stories we have available to us. And I think that I loved teaching, like very much. I've always felt safest inside classrooms talking about books. But most of all, I loved my students. They just impressed me daily. And if anything motivated me or anything was like actively translating between my day job and my writing, it was just a desire to honor that at a risk of being really corny.
No, you cry, Emily. Emily hasn't cried today. We've discussed this earlier. I cried all day when my book was published. Emily hasn't cried once. So my aim.
No.
You know what? I'm going to think of something. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm going to make it happen.
I think this is actually a good segue into the first audience question. Patricia asks, Emily, what are you feeling today? Relief, sadness, wondering how one feels at the release of their first incredible novel.
A little weepy, Emily.
I mean, I have felt a little weepy. It's just the weeping hasn't happened. It's just all suffocating right here. No, I have felt very loved today. So by a lot of people who I'm sure are in this audience, by Ellie, by Northshire, by my incredible team at S&P and my agent Lisa. Everybody has just been wonderful. And I feel like a puddle of gratitude, I think. It's the best way I can put it.
The next question came in from Darren, and he asked if there was a particular event or events in real life that were sort of the beginning of the seed of this book.
Oh, that's a great question, but you know, it feels really hard for me to pinpoint one thing that I drilled down on. I think that girls' schools were kind of the water I was swimming in as a teacher in my 20s, and that it's hard to pick one thread. It was just I was saturated in it, and that's what I wanted to write about, that whole experience, not just one thing.
There's a question from Kay Ebert asking, as you wrote, was there a particular audience you envisioned reading this, and what messages did you hope that they might take away from reading? I don't think I thought too hard about my audience, because I think it would be paralyzing to me to think too hard about who might be reading my work. I think I wrote, I think a lot of times, maybe Ellie feels this way too, I think a lot of times we're writing for ourselves, and that writing is, like any creative work or any art, is really like an act of self-compassion. And I think that perhaps is what kept me going for a while.
Thanks. There's a really sweet question here from Jordan Ferdman. She says, I could definitely be wrong, but on the off chance I'm correct about this, was the novel once called Legacy? If so, what was the reason behind changing the name to All Girls? On the off chance that the disclaimers and qualifiers at the beginning of this question didn't already reveal it, I'm a teenage girl and I'm very excited to read the book.
Oh, thanks, Jordan. You're right. This book was actually initially called Legacy, a title that will make a lot of sense when you finish it without the risk of like spoiling anything. But it also feels like a title that signaled something different about the book, which and the title All Girls is a little bit more, it's equally layered, just like Legacy, but it signals a little more what the heart of the book is, which is that this is a story about the girls, less about what we inherit or what we pass on, although it is about that.
There's another question from Kay Ebert asking, do you have any thoughts about how we can empower young girls within a co-educational environment?
That's a great question. And as someone who's worked in the school, right, I understand that there are hurdles. I think that the best, this sounds so trite, but it's actually, it's the only answer, and the answer is to listen when they talk, to listen when they share. You know, I do, this is making me think of Ellie's earlier question, but I think a lot about Me Too's related mantra, believe women, right? Which at its core means just take them seriously. And I think that is when girls want to participate, when they want to speak out, when they want to assert their ownership over something. I think it's important that we really listen authentically, like honestly, not just for show. There's a lot of adults listening for show in my book, and I think that the difference is listening in a serious way.
Thank you, Emily. There's a question here from Mishy. She says, hi, Emily. Michelle, this is a question from Michelle, not Mishy. Michelle from Toronto. Loved the book. I'm an ex-librarian who is now a PR professional for the library. I loved those emails and correspondence, and it felt very true and real. How did you come up with those, and how did you decide to tell the story that way?
Love librarians. My aunt's a librarian, so thank you. I didn't, so as Ellie already pointed out, right, the book, the adults don't really have, they aren't real active voices in the novel. And I wanted the adult voice, the sort of in loco parentis voice that you have in boarding schools, to be this institutional voice. And I wanted to capture the sort of corporate jargon that is common, very common in situations like this. Because I think it's just such a sharp contrast to the voices and interiority and the thoughtfulness and the seriousness of the girls, to emerge out of their lives into one of these interstitials that is just like cold nonsense, right? That contrast, I think, is what I wanted to show.
So we are just about out of time, but we do have one last question from Jennifer. She says, as a person who struggled with OCD, who also lives in the Chicago suburbs, the way you developed Macy's character was a balm to my soul. You wrote her character so authentically and hopefully as she overcame her fear of the initiation. Which of the characters in the book resonated the most with you?
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. That means a lot to have gotten something right like that. Ellie has asked me this question separately offline. And I have resisted answering it just because it feels like there are parts of myself in all of the girls. I think that there's certainly parts of Macy, the anxious runner, who I identify with, but there's parts of Sloane, the sort of distant ballerina. I'm not a ballerina, but her like sort of her emotional distance that she's working through, that I felt that I was writing from some essential self-understanding on as well.
Well, Emily, that's kind of, I think, a great note to wrap up on. Emily and Ellie, thank you so much for tonight. Emily, thank you for celebrating this exciting day with us. It's really a treat to get to be here with you. Audience, thank you for being here. Please, you can order All Girls and The Divines at northshire.com. So please check those out. Come back to more Northshire events. We do these quite often. And thank you all so much and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for having us. And thanks, Ellie. You're the best.
Oh, no worries. Congratulations.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.